Jimmy Song boot camp for developers, Bitcoin developers, and I asked you how many, and you said 7. I immediately thought of those Mercury astronauts. I think there might have been 7 of them, and they were called the Mercury 7. And that was the beginning of the astronaut role in the United States, and the beginning of the Apollo space program. And one very visionary president, John F. Kennedy, set the motion, set the tone by saying, we will land a man on the moon by the end of the decade. I feel President Bukele, similarly, the JFK meet Steve Jobs of presidents, has made a goal for this country to be absolutely the leader in Bitcoin globally and to make Bitcoin the global standard. And those 7 developers are the beginning. They're going to take this country to the Bitcoin moon. Caucus 7, which was a political organization at that time near to the Weather Underground. You remember, I'm a child of the 70s, and a lot of what happened during that decade I don't remember. But Stacy math, which is kind of not Euclidean geometry, it's not algebra, it's a special mathematical formula that's built on the root of 7 and then goes in a direction that many would say is improbable.
Exactly. Well, you know what is improbable is default here in El Salvador, because failure is not an option. El Salvador will not fail. And we have said that. I've said that many times on Twitter when people keep on saying El Salvador has failed, like the Bitcoin program policy has failed. It hasn't failed. And they keep on saying that it's going to default. And I tell Bloomberg, I tell Wall Street Journal, and I've told them it's not going to default. And they choose not to quote me. They choose instead to quote the people who say it's going to fail. So Morgan Stanley agrees with me, because here's the headline: Morgan Stanley encourages investors to buy battered El Salvador Eurobond. Why they had this image, and it dawned on me that they think this is President Bukele, but it looks like some deranged honky. Like, look at that.
Oh, that's Jamie Dimon. Right before they shot a scene from Eyes Wide Shut. He's with a group of scantily clad bankers somewhere in a lair underneath Wall Street doing unnatural things.
Right. Well, anyway, they said that Morgan Stanley is encouraging their clients to buy these El Salvador bonds because they're trading at 25 cents, when they said even if they do default, they should be trading at 43 cents, not 25 cents. But they reckon they're not going to default because they have the money to pay the payment due in January.
Private equity guy from Switzerland. He's been on our show. And he said, look, the way the private equity crowd is looking at these bonds is at 23, 24 cents on the dollar. It's an easy double. And because the underlying fundamentals in this country are outstanding, and the market is unusually punishing these bonds purely out of spite, purely for political reasons. And so this is where private equity, that's how you become a billionaire. That's why Josue's going to be a billionaire, because he looks at this stuff and he's like, you know what? I want to be a billionaire. I'm going to buy this paper at 23 cents on the dollar. It's going to go to 40, 50, 60 cents on the dollar, and I'm going to have the last laugh. That's how billionaires become billionaires.
So the guy who wrote this for Morgan Stanley, his name is Simon Weaver. He's the global head of emerging market sovereign credit strategy at Morgan Stanley. And he told investors in a Tuesday note that El Salvador's bonds are overly punished by the market conditions, despite the country having better financial metrics than many of its peers, reported Bloomberg. The note to investors read, markets are clearly pricing in a high probability of the autarky scene in which El Salvador defaults, means self-sufficiency, independence, specifically national economic self-sufficiency and independence, a policy of establishing a self-sufficient and independent national economy, which kind of sounds like positive, but in fact it means a negative thing in terms of economics, because it's like you're shut off from the rest of the global economy.
I've never seen the word autarky in a financial report. And you're right. When you first see it, you're like, well, that's a positive thing, because they're insulating themselves from the vagaries of these outside markets that seem like they're in chaos. And they have Bitcoin, and they're growing their own GDP organically. They've got the tourism. They've got the forward investment coming in. They've got the infrastructure build out. And they really are, it really is an autarky. But that's in this context, that's not a negative. And I think that's where investors potentially need an asset, to put it in pure financial terms. When you're investing today in a world dominated by these global central banks, who are all on the same trade. They're all on the same side of the same trade, and that is easy money. El Salvador is going against the trend and saying, you know, we can grow organically our own economy. Bitcoin is at the center of it, and we're not exposed to that risk. So if you're trying to get an uncorrelated trade and get pure alpha, pure return, El Salvador is probably the best, most underrated play in the globe today.
Of course, the president, every investment in the country, people are investing in this country. He's inviting people into this country. That's what he said in the State of the Union. He wants people to come to this country. That's the opposite of autarky. He's not closing it off. So they're wrong. Well, Morgan Stanley is telling their clients they're wrong to bet on that. That's not the outcome. But of course, what they're doing is they're reading the wrong newspapers or tuning into the wrong shows on YouTube. They should be tuning into this sort of program rather than Bloomberg, rather than Wall Street Journal. As I said earlier, they have spoken to me but failed to quote me, even though I told them months ago, people could have got in at 25 cents or under 25 cents and said they're going to have to get in at 45, 55, 65 cents instead when these bond payments are made. And there was a recent report out in the past week or so from one of these financial newspapers, and they said that the number one assessed that El Salvador shouldn't have any problem repaying debts for the next 12 months because of the primary surplus. Plus, it has smaller maturities coming due than other distressed nations like Argentina, Egypt, and Ukraine. So again, people are listening to the wrong information, and they're going to lose money by listening to the wrong information. But that's what bias does. That's what political bias, cultural bias, any sort of bias is a way to lose money. That's a way to lose money because you get sold a bag of bad investment advice.
Right, markets can remain irrational longer than you have funds. And so having a bias in a market setting can be death to a portfolio performance. And to your point, it's an autarky not by the suggestion of the world and saying, come on in and invest. And they're getting a lot of investment from around the world, but it's the perception from people who have that bias. And that's why they're missing the bet. They can't even describe it accurately in a financial paper. And that's where the smart money sees, you know what, there's an arbitrage here between the perception and what's really on the ground. And obviously Salvadorans who are in the money market business, as we've just mentioned, they are salivating at this opportunity, and money's being raised in the billions.
Right. I mean, again, they don't give agency to the people here, the president here. He himself gets up on stage and says, we're going to be like Singapore. And yet they decide in the mainstream financial press to just report what they themselves say about the country. They're saying oh, it's like an...
I was a stockbroker in the 80s, very successful. I had a .com in the 90s, very successful. I started buying Bitcoin in 2011 at $1, very successful. I'm now in El Salvador. Is that a freaking coincidence? Or am I going to be in the place that I want to be? I want to be in the hot place. I want to be in the hot market. I want to be where the parrots and the torgos are flying around free to be who they are. And I want to have Bitcoin grenades exploding and all over the world. And I want this to work. And I want it to work this week. That's what I want.